Good morning. Welcome to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee's Connected Systems Institute lecture series. My name is Charles Mosley, and I'll be your host for today's conversation, How to Be an Effective Change Agent, presented here today by John Fortin and Allan Klotsche. Before we go to them, a word from our Executive Director, Mary Bunzel. Unmute, Mary.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you everybody for joining today for this very important lecture. You know, change management is really hard. It's super hard to move a whole organization forward, even though the goal might be very inspirational. Coordinating that and making it effective is key to the success of any program. And so as we complete and devote our mission to helping you connect to information that's really important, we're very pleased to welcome John Fortin and Allan Klotzky here to talk with us today. So I think you'll really enjoy this lecture, and I'll look forward to it myself. Thank you, Charles. Thanks, John and Allan.
Thank you. So John Fortin is a published author and the Global Technology Lead for Asset Management at Jacobs with over 30 years of facilities lifestyle experience, including design, construction, and O&M. He has developed and implemented effective organizational change management programs required to implement a sustainable asset management culture. Allan is the president of National Business Furniture and currently serves as an executive in residence at the Lubar School of Business, where he teaches in the Executive MBA program, mentors entrepreneurs and startup organizations, and is a frequent lecturer on topics including strategy execution, accountability, change management, and servant leadership. Now, before we begin, some housekeeping. Please mute your mics and enter questions into the Q&A chat box, which we'll answer at the end of the event. All right? Okay, gentlemen, so let's get started. Before a person or organization embarks on a major change initiative, what should they start thinking about?
I'll jump in on this one, Charles. First of all, thanks, Charles and Mary, for having us on such an important topic and certainly timely in today's environment. I think when organizations and individuals decide that they need to make a significant change in the organization, the first thing that they need to focus on is making sure that they can articulate the why. Out of all the organizations that I've worked with, those that struggle with change management really don't have the why very well defined up front. And I found that people don't resist change itself, but they resist it when they don't understand the why behind the change in the first place. And, you know, when we talk about the why, we have to understand that people are wired differently. And so let's say that we're trying to drive change, significant change across an organization, and you've got what I call left brain people and right brain people, right? So your left brain people are the people that lead with analytical thinking. And so as you're trying to explain the why to them and get them excited about the change, they need to hear stuff like our return on net assets are going to improve by this, or our EBITDA, or our market share. Those are things that very well connect to left brain individuals. But if you took that same message to, let's say, the marketing or the innovation team, holy smokes, they'd be asleep with that and they'd be bored to death. They need to understand how this is going to reignite customer passion around our products and how this is going to leapfrog the competition. And so that's what I mean. It's not that you're schizophrenic with your message, but when you create this why, you've got to make sure that you're appealing to both the left brain and the right brain people. And I always like to say that when you're driving change as a change agent, you should have this kind of pre-canned elevator pitch, and not written down on a 3x5 note card that you boringly recite to other people, but you've got to help them understand things like, why is the change necessary? Why is this happening now versus any other point in time? What's wrong with how we're doing things today? And you've got to be careful that we don't criticize too much of the past. The world is changing faster than ever. And so it doesn't mean that the things that we've done in the past are bad. They just might not be appropriate for the pace in which the world's changing going forward. And then finally, we have to help them understand, what does the new state look like? So we're going to go through this chaotic period, and then we're going to come to the perfection state at the end. And what does that look like? What does it feel like? How do we act with one another during those times? So that would be my recommendation of where organizations should start.
Great, Charles. Yeah, that was fantastic. This is John. So I think when you talk about the future state, I like that, and bringing folks along with you on that journey of what the future state looks like. And if you could point them to an example or a company that's actually done it before and what it will feel like and look like to them daily, I think that's a good way to do that. And I call them those key stakeholders. So we can bring them along in establishing the why. That's very helpful as well. That way they can be champions and communicate to the rest of the organization, if you will. So that was good. That was very nice, Allan.
Sorry, was muted. All right, so once we understand the why and the vision for the future, John, how we go about building a path forward?
Yeah, good question. I think so. A lot of the work we do is we look at what we call maybe a maturity assessment and a roadmap, especially in the space of asset management where I work, and we look at organizations and we go in with, it could be a very simple 40-question survey or a 100-question survey. It depends on the organization itself and how ready they are for the change. And what we call it is a maturity assessment and a roadmap. And we go in and we will talk with staff. We will score them from a 1 to 5 scale, if you will, where 1 is a novice and 5 might be world class. And then we come back with that rating and we sit with the leadership team or the governance body and we prioritize the work that's going to be going forward, because most organizations have a lot of change going on, a lot of strategic initiatives, and so making sure that they're integrated on what the path forward looks like. And we would take that roadmap and actually put it into a Gantt chart, if you will. And I like to say, it's about change, but a lot of people don't manage it like a capital construction project, which I like to point people to with a scope, a schedule, a budget, a project manager, and a cross-functional team. So building that maturity assessment roadmap and a governance body moving forward is one path forward.
Yeah, John, I'm glad to hear you highlight the importance of surveying the individuals across the organization, because I think too often senior leaders hole up in a conference room and they figure out that they feel like it's incumbent upon the 8 of them or whatever it is to solve this problem by themselves, and they hole up for weeks on end in a conference room, and they're really ignoring the wisdom that exists in the organization. When I talked about connecting with the individuals, one great way to do it is what you were talking about, John, is to get out and ask their opinions. And certainly we as leaders have to have a broad vision for where we want to go and kind of what this is going to look like. But how you paint in between the lines is yet to be determined then. And you can pick up significant buy-in across the organization if people feel like their thoughts are being heard through the process. And 9 times out of 10 great ideas that I've had experience with have come from the middle of the organization. These are the people that are struggling with the current processes that we have, right? As leaders, if we're trying to make something more efficient or process data faster or whatever, don't you think that these people are going home every night frustrated that it takes them so long to do something? And so it's a great way to involve them. So I certainly agree with that.
Yeah, Allan, that's good. I think what I was going to just jump in there, old cookie Charles, is, even though we build these roadmaps, and I talk about a construction project many times, that's a very rigid schedule. But what I would say for change initiatives is we need to be less rigid, because many of these big initiatives take years and people change, people leave the organization. And so just being flexible in your state of thinking around that schedule and maybe even checking in on an annual basis is something that we recommend.
All right. So, Allan, you have mentioned the importance of communication. Can you share with us some of your experiences that have worked effectively and maybe not as effectively?
Yeah, unfortunately, I've got experiences in each bucket, Charles. The one thing is when I go in and talk to different companies, et cetera, and employees, I never once in the entirety of my career have heard an employee say, I am so sick of leadership communicating to us. It's always the opposite, is that we never hear enough. Yet as leaders, sometimes we feel like, oh man, I've explained this to the organization so many times. And I think Jack Welch had a quote that I enjoy is, you've got to communicate and communicate and communicate so often, and that you're about halfway there when you feel like you're going to throw up on your own words. And And so it's oftentimes we live in this hurried work day, and our calendars are filled up with meetings, and we just don't take the appropriate time or budget the appropriate time to be communicating to our organization. And so what we have to recognize, though, is that number one, people hear messages differently, right? So some people like to read emails. Some people like to have one-on-one meetings. Some people like to have town hall meetings. And oftentimes, if you're driving a significant change in the organization, let's say you hold a town hall meeting on Monday, and on Thursday you do the exact same town hall meeting, almost verbatim to the key points that you're trying to drive home. I guarantee you there's a large portion of the audience that feels like they heard something new that second time, because as they're hearing the message, depending on the magnitude of change, as they're hearing the message the first time, the second that something comes across that trips their paradigm, they're stuck. And you're continuing to go on and talk as a leader, and their mind is wrapped around this curveball that just touched them individually, and they don't hear the rest of your message. And so being able to communicate that in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different forums, I found is really, really important. And again, I'll stress what I said before, is that a lot of times leaders will say, but I don't get it. I held one town hall 3 months ago and we put up posters all over the cafeteria. So why don't people understand what it is that we're trying to do? I mean, the other thing is that change and the awareness for the need for change comes at different times for different individuals, right? So as a senior leader tasked with driving an organization, you may be wrestling with a topic for a month or two. And then finally this eureka comes and you decide, okay, we're going to move forward 3 steps to the left. Well, at the point that you decide that, your mind is moving into stage 2 of how do we execute. But the rest of the organization is 2 months behind you, and you need to have that kind of peripheral vision or emotional intelligence to understand that, and at times slow down to make sure the organization can catch up with you.
John, you're muted.
Of course, I'm muted. That was perfect, Allan. What I would maybe add to that is a formal communications plan that you can point to. And we like to, I'm very much a fan of chartering teams. And so chartering a communications team that sort of owns the messaging, and hopefully with some professionals involved. I'm a mechanical engineer and I've done a lot of that, but it just comes naturally for some reason. But, if the organization has comms people, how can you leverage that? And for example, in a communications plan, there might be, say, 5 different things that are in there. One is the type of communication, and that could be presentation, flyers, internet, right? The second thing might be the purpose or description of that, and it's to, lead the change effort, be the elevator speech, talk about success stories, then the target audience or participation, because as you mentioned, not everybody learns the same. So some might be the strategic leadership, employees, the public, it depends. Then the fourth might be a distribution channel. So is it an open forum? Is it a newsletter? Is it a meeting, poster, flyer? And then the last thing is like a frequency. When, how often is that? Is it monthly? Is it quarterly, annually? And so I find having, just a formal, and you can Google, communications plans, and there's a bunch of them out there, but that's what I would build on. And the other thing I would just say in closing is, making sure leadership walks the talk. And I've had some really good success with people that like they do a walkabout, if you will. If in fact the organization is on, say a central location, then that makes it easier, of course. But making sure that the leadership is talking the same lingo, across the organization. So that's what I would add to that a little bit.
Yeah, John, I can't stress that enough. When leaders are driving change, your visibility is paramount in the organization. This is not the time to be holed up in your office. This is not the time to be wall-to-wall executive meetings. You use the phrase walk the talk, John. That's absolutely perfect. And leaders need to make sure that they're visible so that they can sense where the organization is, how the organization's feeling. But equally as importantly, leaders don't have all the answers, as we talked about. And on one of these walks that you're going to have, there's a nugget. You just have to go out and find where that nugget is and make sure that you're allocating enough time to do that.
All right. John, I'll start off with you with this question. I've heard that we need an executive sponsor as a key member of a change coalition. What kind of activities would we expect of him or her?
Charles, great question. And you mentioned earlier I published a book. The first edition was 2016, and I've got leadership in there, but a lot of my clients were asking me, they're executive sponsors. What do we do now? So when I did a second release in 2018, I have a chapter on executive sponsorship, and I call it the art of executive sponsorship, the attributes, roles, responsibilities, and the top 5 success factors. And so but a couple things about that is, firstly, making sure you have the right executive sponsor. A lot of times people are put in that position and they're not necessarily the right person. So I put a 360-degree review sheet in the book to talk about, if you don't have it or you want to delegate because maybe that person's not the right one, who do you delegate it to? And so there's a list of, attributes in there, but the things that I see them doing, and I created a little success life cycle graph for them. And so they should be involved in that strategic planning, the visioning, right? The assessment part of it we talked about, and the communication. So the success outcomes for them, I would say, is leadership engagement. So making sure that they're at the right level of the organization and they're talking to their peers about the change, because everyone has their little pet project. So making sure that they're engaging the other leadership in the initiative. They're involved with the visioning we talked about, so the why, I'd call it, and chartering. Again, I mentioned I like to charter, so chartering a governance committee that would own the project. So the executive sponsor will be involved with that. Identifying critical success and risk factors. What's going to sink the project, and what do we do to avoid that? Looking at the business case, depends on the size and effort of change, but a lot of times there's a reason why you're changing from a financial standpoint. So making sure they're co-authors to the business case, and then making sure before you launch that, I call it a readiness to execute survey. So before you're ready to execute that change, what are those soft things? I call them the soft or the people factors that we need to make sure they're in place. And then once they launch, making sure they check back in on the critical success factors and the readiness things throughout the life cycle of the project, and having a pulse on what's going on. So there is a lot of effort there, and I think a lot of times people don't understand what they're required to do. But those are a couple things that I would perhaps point you to.
Yeah, I think that's great feedback, John. And Charles, the way you asked the question was an executive sponsor, and I think it depends on the level of change that we're trying to drive in an organization. But clearly, if you're trying to drive significant change, it is really important to have an executive sponsor. I was working with a company yesterday who was looking to take a new product development process from a stage gate process to an agile process, which, for those of you that are familiar with that, it's a pretty significant philosophical change. And they were wondering and debating whether they could drive that change from the middle of the organization, okay? Because that's a little bit in their culture. And it's like, I think when you have something that's so significant that's going to tweak the culture of your organization, it's really important to have the executive sponsor and the type of person that John was talking about. Person's got to have kind of built-in credibility within the organization. And I think they also have to have a real eye for talent, because maybe on this call, we'll talk a little bit later about change coalitions, et cetera, but this executive sponsor isn't going to do it by themselves. And so perhaps kind of like a board of directors, one of their most important roles is picking the right talent to be on that change team to make sure that the change is effective. So yeah, a really important role, the executive sponsor.
All right, excellent. So what advice would you have to managers who face one or more resistors to their change efforts?
Actually, it's funny. I feel that resistors are underrated. Let me explain that a little bit, because oftentimes people are like, oh, they're the pain in my backside, and they're so disruptive to the project and we can't get things going. But I actually feel a little bit differently. And so let me see, Charles, if I can quickly share a visual image with the group.
Sure.
Charles, maybe you could just give me a signal when that comes up.
1 second.
Okay.
All right, there you go. It's on the screen.
Okay, great. So the visual that we're looking at here is not to get too academic, but on the left-hand axis, we have an individual's response to the proposed change. So are they, is their response active or passive? And on the bottom axis, we have their attitude towards the change. So is their attitude negative, against it, or positive for it? And so as we quickly look at this graphic, let's start with an easy box, the upper right-hand side. So these people are the change agents. They're the very obvious change agents, because if you look at where they sit on this, their attitude towards change is very positive and their response is very active. So when you're in a meeting talking about that, you know, we need to go in a different direction and you've got a half an hour pitch planned out, they're the ones with their hands up after 15 minutes saying, sign me up, coach. I want to be part of this team. So they're very obvious, and so they can be your disciples and go out into the organization and help you drive this change. Perhaps equally as powerful are the people right below them, the silent adapters, and they feel equally as good. Their attitude towards this change is equally as positive. They're just less vocal. So when you're sitting in a room of 50 people, you don't really know who they are because they're not jumping up and down out of their seat. So your task with these people is to ferret them out, find out who they are in the organization. And this is where John was talking before about walk the walk and getting out and interacting with your teams. This is a great way to figure that out, as well as your change agents probably have a pretty good idea who they are as well. But now let me come over to the left-hand side. And when we talk about this in an academic setting, I always say, you know, which one of these boxes, the resistors or the traditionalists, do you fear the most? And most of the time people say, oh, the resistors, because they're so active. They're the ones that stand up in the meeting and say, Al, this is the stupidest idea. You don't understand. We've tried this 4 years ago and it failed miserably. Well, actually, those are the people that are really valuable, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because the traditionalists have a very negative approach to the change that we're driving, but unfortunately they're passive. So I don't even know who they are. I'll be walking down the hall past the water cooler and they'll be sniping you in your back behind that. So these are very dangerous people within the organization, unlike those resistors that I was talking about. Whereas after you leave the group setting where they were a bit disruptive, you sit down with them and you try to understand. You use a more of a servant leadership approach, and you say, you know, I'll pick on you, Charles, but you know, I noticed that you were really concerned about the change that we were driving, and can you help me understand what I'm missing, what I'm failing to see in your approach to things? And immediately that kind of humbling approach settles them down, and you're going to learn a lot from those individuals because they're not the only ones that's feeling that way. And after you interchange with them and you go back and forth for whatever, 2 or 3 times, the next time you have the all-employee meeting and that person raises their hand, most of the organization's like, oh no, here he goes again, and this is going to be just a train wreck. But they do a 180 and they say, Al, this is a great idea, but we're not going fast enough. How do we drive this thing faster? And that just flips the organization on their side to say, whoa, what happened here? There must be something really good that I don't understand. So the ability to convert the resistors over to those change agents is, in my estimation, absolutely worth the effort, and it will pay significant dividends.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Alan. I love this slide. I've never seen it in this light, but I like the way it's presented here, because it allows you to really give some thought around those types of people, right? And how do you deal with that proactively, if you will? And I like what you said. You know, I have always put there, listen, you know, to people that want to resist or speak up, because they can make them part of the solution. And I think that's what I've seen in the past. And there's a phrase out there: involvement breeds commitment. And so I like to get the folks involved. Again, I'll talk about the team chartering. So in the maturity assessment, you know, what comes out of those is a whole bunch of activities. Typically, they're grouped in a different you know, bulk of activities, and so I like to charter these small teams of people working on these projects. And it might be a month or two's worth of effort, but getting them involved early on in that chartering and understanding, and my charter will always have like, what are the expected benefits of the activity? And so making sure that they're part of that, so they actually begin to build the activities around the change, the detailed activities, things have to happen day to day. In addition, there's a couple other things I like to do is, I like to have them speak with, other organizations that have done this, whether it be within their organization, just a different department, outside to visit peers or talk to peers. The other thing is attend conferences. In the space that I'm in maintenance, reliability, and asset management, there's quite a few conferences, and I'll tell leadership, hey, make sure we send, the change agents or the resistors to the conferences, and they're going to hear the best practice case studies. They're going to see what success looks like, and so they'll learn at their pace. And so that has been very, very successful, as well as during the change. I like to, as part of the communications, which we talked about earlier, is celebrating those successes and actually giving credit. So I like to take pictures and I like to put names next to the people that are involved and be very active about giving people credit, around that part of the change, if you will, the attitude and the responses to change.
Yeah. John, you mentioned something that I thought was really interesting, and you talked about benchmarking and going to peer organizations and even going outside of your own the markets that you serve. And I think that's so important today. It's one of the things that I think organizations have gotten pretty decent at benchmarking within their own industry. But it's interesting, if you look at where disruptive change is coming from, it doesn't come from within your own industry. Typically, it comes from outside your industry. And so I think that's really wise advice, John, is as you're doing your benchmarking, think about, if you're trying to do something around a particular technology, not who in your core markets does that best, but who in the world does that best. Even if it doesn't seem completely similar to what you're doing, that's where we find a lot of disruptive change coming from, is outside the core industries.
Very, very good.
All right, John, I'll ask you this question. In what ways can we help resistors and those on the fence see the value of adopting new best practices?
Good question. It follows on very nicely from the last question. It sort of would use some of those, involvement, chartering, listening, speaking with peers, visiting visiting peers and attending conferences, and giving credit. I think the other thing that's been very effective is what's called a formal stakeholder analysis, where you can actually look at the chart that's on the screen here, and you can go through a very formal stakeholder analysis and see who's going to potentially sink the ship, who are the people that are on the fence, who are the resistors, and then through that stakeholder analysis, you will actually come up with tactics to get those people, to continue having their support or to help turn them around, get them off the fence on your side. And a lot of it will be those tactics I mentioned, but by involving them. A lot of times we will look at, who are the influential people in an organization. If the change is in a highly unionized organization, which my work tends to be, the union leadership, making sure you involve them early, because they're typically, what's in it for us. It's the whole what's in it for me with them. And so really being proactive, just the other day I was talking to leadership in a project, and I said, well, have you talked to the union reps yet? And they said, well, no, that's not going to be a problem. I said, well, just they're one of your stakeholders. That's part of your whole stakeholder analysis, that they make sure that they're actually, they understand what the change is going to be and the positive things that are going to come out of it, for them and for the union, group behind them. So just being proactive on that. I guess it builds back on that previous question a little bit.
Yeah, John, I'm just going to reiterate. I wrote it down, and we'll use it in the future with your permission. But involvement breeds commitment. 3 words, simple words, but very, very powerful when you're talking about the things that we are here.
All right, let's move on to the next one. Allan, when you're building a change coalition, what are some of the things you look for when assembling your team?
Well, I guess a couple of things, Charles. First of all, I look for people that have a strong influence within the organization. So I'm not talking about the people that speak the most, I'm talking about the people whose voices really are credible within the organization. And because you need these evangelists to go out and spread this change throughout the team or throughout the organization. And so first and foremost, I've got to have people on the team that have an influence. So when they go out with or without me and they begin speaking about this, that they have kind of instant credibility. The second thing is, we touched a little bit on this, but change is difficult. I think the data, and John, you're probably closer to this than I am, but the data says that at least 60–70% of change efforts fail. And so it's like, well, those aren't very good odds to start with here, right? And so while I'm a huge believer in internal development and developing high potential people and building out development plans, in my estimation, this isn't really the place to do it. If you're needing to drive significant change, I typically will not choose someone that's still got their training wheels on around this. I want to choose someone that has been around the block a number of times, specifically relative to driving change. So this isn't a how old are they, it's how much change have they driven in their career, because we've all made mistakes. We don't have nearly enough time on this podcast for me to list the mistakes that I've made driving change, but I learn from those mistakes, as we all do. So those would probably be the two most important things, is their influence in the organization and their vast experience driving change, so that we can get on the same page and speak shorthand right away in typically a pretty turbulent time.
That's great, Alan. I totally agree. A term I like to use, and you can't get them always, but positive energy. Folks, if you can get some positive energy folks in the team, they're not, this isn't going to work, we're going to fail. I mean, just building some positive energy around that. And it could be, younger, mid-career folks, older folks. You mentioned it, and I would say not necessarily knowledge around change, but knowledge around the topic at hand, and they've been there before. If you're changing out a technology or you're doing something with the maintenance tools and techniques, having some expertise or knowledge around that. And if you don't, that's where you might bring in some outside expertise, consultants, if you will. And then I mentioned a lot about teams, so you got to be a team player. A lot of things I like to do is have cross-functional teams, because I always find that it's not, if it's a maintenance issue or technology issue, it's not just IT, it's not just a maintenance person, it's not operations. Everyone has a hand in making all these various processes work. So having a cross-functional team and picking people that can work well together, in the sandbox, and then making sure, we set ground rules, around that as well. It's never going to be perfect, but, if you can get the majority of the team with some of those attributes, positive energy, expertise and knowledge, and a team player, then I've seen the odds go up, pretty significantly.
Yeah, John, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. You talked about the potential use of outside consultants, and certainly there's a lot of there's individuals, there's big companies, and there's everything in between. And my experience has shown that when companies are really struggling from a performance standpoint, and perhaps the employees' confidence in leadership is wavering a little bit, that's where you can get a disproportional return on your investment in the use of outside consultants. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, you live in this world.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's more so in the public sector, if you will, where leadership doesn't always, you'll hear it all the time. We've told leadership this 10 times. We've told them this before. They don't listen. And I think that's more in the private sector, if you will. And so bringing in an outside consultant has been very, very helpful. And as long as that consultant sees their job as working themselves out of a job, transitioning in, that's how I was taught years ago. We had a 5-year project, and we brought in 5 consultants, and they actually sat, in the shops with us. And in year 4, there was 4. Year 2 there was 4, then there was 3, then 2. Then at the end, year 5 there was 1 consultant, and they just did knowledge transfer, if you will. It was very, very effective if you can do that. But you're right. Sometimes that is a challenge with leadership. Maybe not, and I guess the other thing too is you've got a variance of opinion a lot of times in these big organizations, and bringing in an expert that can maybe channel the thinking so that, one department's not taking control over the rest of the conversation. Maybe the consultant can help steer that conversation, and so everyone has an equal voice, in the solution. A good question,
Yeah.
Alan.
I think sometimes we get so close and embroiled in the details that sometimes it's difficult to see the forest through the trees. And that's where, when I've worked with really effective consultants, at the end of the day, they'll summarize things, and boy, they picked out 2 or 3 nuggets that were the game changers, but they were difficult to see and hear for the internal team, as everybody, sometimes has their opinions and can't wait for the person before them to stop talking so they can jump in with their thoughts. So yeah, definitely a positive role for that.
Right. I think, just to build on that, is in many organizations, people have been working together for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. A lot of the organizations you and I work with have been around. They're in business to be in business, universities and water and power plants. They're not going out of business, but a lot of times people have been together for many, many years, and it's human nature. But if I made you upset, Alan, 20 years ago in one meeting, you may not want to talk to me ever again. And all of a sudden we're in these conversations. So you have to be cognizant of that. It's just, there's a family, aspect to businesses, and being respectful of that, and knowing that, I might have said something that you didn't like, a couple of years ago, and you sort of been holding that against me. So, that's why I say if you have people with positive energy coming forth and chiming in, and a lot of times they'll leave that stuff behind, but it can be a challenge. And it's a natural thing to be thinking about.
Yeah. Good news, John. You haven't said anything that's put me on ends yet, so we're still friends.
All
Charles,
right. Well,
good job moderating.
Well, thank you. I try. You guys have been giving us a lot of great information, and right now we're going to start the Q&A section of our webinar today. So the first one is from our executive director, Mary Bunzel. Speaking of nuggets, certain people hear things in different ways, from a financial perspective, for example, versus a high-level strategy perspective. Do you have recommendations on how to identify each, and should you tune your communications to connect with these different types?
I think
yours.
Yeah, I think absolutely, Mary. You need to tune your communications. And, as I've worked with different change agents about this particular topic, they're like, but doesn't that make me kind of schizophrenic, as I'm saying one thing on Monday and a different thing on Tuesday? And my answer is no. I think it shows an incredible emotional intelligence when you recognize that your core message can't change. Okay, that would make you schizophrenic. But after you understand the core message, going back to what we were talking about, left brain, right brain people, you have to speak their language. And if you can speak their language and connect with them, then we can ingrain them and involve them deeply in the change management process. But you've got, sometimes I call it an elevator pitch. You literally have about 2 or 3 minutes in the beginning when you're presenting this change to someone, that if you're not speaking a language that they understand and gets them excited, they're tuned out. And then you have a lot of work to do to bring them back on track. So I think it is important to very much do that.
Yeah, great question, Mary, and good response, Alan. Yeah, again, that's sort of what that communications plan is about. It talks about the different audiences, and people, like you said earlier, Alan, they learn differently. They're going to pick things up at different times, and so just having that constant messaging, and making sure that the people giving the messaging, they believe in it as well, and you practice. Making sure you're practicing with the people giving the messaging, whether it be in a group forum, or individual. So yeah, good question, Mary. You have to be very, very, I guess, as Alan said, a little schizophrenic going back and forth, but that's just the nature of the way people learn and hear.
All right, I'll point this question towards you, John, since Allan mentioned it earlier. He mentioned that 60 to 70% of change initiatives fail. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a couple of studies out there. So there's been a lot of studies put to that. Harvard's done a couple of them. The industry I'm in have done a couple. And I'm doing a little bit of research myself. And, there's a couple things that I would point to, and Allan has seen some more things, and I might leave a few out, but, executive sponsorship is going to be an important component. I think that up there with that is understanding the why. What's the vision? What's the goal? Where are we going? Why are we doing this? You know, what's in it for me? You know, what's the end state going to look like? Having good project management skills came up in this little study I've been doing. Is, you know, managing the change like I call it like a capital construction project. How do you build a building? You got a scope, you got a schedule, you got a budget, multi-year effort. You've got cross-functional teams. Someone's keeping an eye on the ball. Some people have mentioned a good business case. That's sort of part of the why, if you will. But again, and then I guess I'll just leave it at involvement breeds commitment. You know, and people that have been involved, no matter where you are in the organization, have been involved in, you know, articulating the future state because they've been there, they've done it. They're going to be sort of your change agent. So there's like maybe 4 or 5 things right there off the top of my head. And Allan's been through so many as well. He might, you know, add a bunch more to that.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the big ones, John. I mean, it's the importance of the why. We started our discussion with that, and that to me is of paramount importance. And so we've got to get that. And the other ones that you mentioned are great too. I think that, you know, one of the other things, Charles, that I don't want to stomp on other questions that are coming in, but one of the other things that we might want to talk about is, you know, creating a culture where change can exist in a healthy way. I mean, we've all seen organizations where a newcomer comes into an organization and they're all bubbly and fresh with ideas on day one. And if they're told in day one and week one and month one, oh, that's not how we do things here. No, you got to understand this is how we do things here, and that's never going to work. All of a sudden, that energy and an enthusiasm that the person brings gets squashed. And I think we have to look at ourselves as organizations and say, are we building a culture that fosters or it drives innovation? Because with innovation is going to come change. Or are we squashing that? And, you know, how do we do it? If we have autocratic, it's kind of top-down, silo-driven organizations, that's not the type of environment that fosters creativity and subsequently change. And so I think that, you know, one of the things that I've done in previous companies, when we look at the leadership behaviors, the desired leadership behaviors, you know, you need to put some of those things in. Oftentimes organizations focus on, you know, accountability and discipline, and did you hit your sales number and your EBITDA numbers, et cetera, but they fail to embrace and reward the emotional intelligence side of things, which fosters this innovation and drives change. So I think when companies say, boy, we struggle so much with driving change, besides the things that John was talking about, I also would guess that maybe there's a cultural underlying element that's making it difficult.
Interesting. Well, each of you has mentioned the importance of executive sponsorship to help foster change in his organization. Is executive sponsorship as important for a top-down organizational chart as it is for a horizontal education organizational chart? And the floor is to either of you on that one.
I'd have to say, well, in all the work I've done, you need to have an executive sponsor when it comes to any sort of change. In my humble, beginnings, et cetera. So making sure that someone, I'm looking up some of my notes from the research, and it said, having a shared vision across the leadership team. So you've got an executive sponsor that's going to have building that vision, but they're going to make sure that the other executives sort of get it as well. Because as I mentioned earlier, every organization is going through constant change. And so someone's got their pet project for the year. And so making sure that there's somebody, a spokesperson at the top, that when it comes to making resource decisions, financial decisions, schedule, start-stop decisions on projects, that you've got a voice at the top. So I guess I would say that I think it's important no matter what. But Allan, you might have some other insight to that as well.
No, I agree with you, John. I think the more significant the change, the more important it is to have that executive sponsor, right? If you're changing your food vendor in the cafe, not a big deal, right? That can be done elsewhere. But, a lot of times we're talking about things such as changing out technology platforms, putting in new ERP investments, 5-year, $20 million type stuff. We're talking about divesting businesses, acquiring businesses, closing facilities. I pity the poor change agent who doesn't have an executive sponsor around those things. And as a matter of fact, I've often consulted with mid-level change agents, and that's one of the first questions that I ask them is, who's the executive sponsor and what's your relationship with her or him? And if they give me a blank stare like, well, we don't have one, I say run to the hills. Don't sign up for this project. It will be a disaster for you, because I know there's some research that says change can be driven from the middle of the organization. And it can in some respects, but the bigger ones need executive sponsorship. If an executive sponsor is really intelligent and a great change agent, what they will do when we talked about building that change coalition, they will then pick people from different parts of the organization at different levels too. I mean, one of the most successful changes that I ever drove in my career had 6 people on the change coalition team, and the most important of the 6 was our maintenance manager, because we were doing a complete 5S lean transformation of a manufacturing facility. And so we were picking up very large pieces of equipment that had air drops and electrical drops, et cetera. And the reason that he was so critical to our successful change was that he felt like he was on the inside. He was on the inner workings of this team. And it wasn't us going to him on a Friday afternoon saying, hey, Rick, this weekend you need to have your whole team working, double time because we need these pieces of equipment moved, et cetera. That would have failed to help him understand the why. But when he was in those teams, and when I, in this case, as the executive sponsor, built that change coalition team with the appropriate people, it was able to move at lightning speed.
Yeah, that's great. Great answer. And I think I'm picturing in my head, this change coalition. And typically for me, we have an executive sponsor at the top. And you think of a hierarchy. Below that is a steering committee. And the steering committee is typically the mid-level managers that have to actually support and make the change, where the executive sponsor is somebody maybe up at the CEO level of the organization, chief financial officer, chief executive officer, et cetera. And then below that steering committee are these work teams that we chart. It might be a communications team or a technology team, et cetera. So you definitely have to involve all levels, from the shop floor to middle management, to executives. And again, as Allan said, depends on the level of change you're going through. If you're doing the cafeteria redo, then that's not a big deal. But if you're bringing in a brand new piece of software, or a lot of my organizations go through these big maturity assessments, and it's a 5-year heavy lift. So they're always thinking about that long-term stability of the change. So I was just thinking about that hierarchy in my head, if that helped with that response.
All right. Can both of you share a few traits of unsuccessful change management initiatives that you have driven or witnessed?
Well, I'll have to change the names to protect the innocent here, Charles, including my own. It's sort of the opposite of the success models that we've been talking about. The one change that I saw pretty close up was a change where the why was 100% financial. So if we do this, our performance will move the stock price from X to Y, right? And that was a very significant number. And for less than 1% of the population of the company, that was really meaningful. Unfortunately, for 99% of the population, it didn't mean a thing. And so having a message that resonates with people, or bifurcating that message is really important. So that would be one thing. I think that setting unrealistic expectations from a timing standpoint can also lead to ineffective change. And this process of helping people understand the why. I know I sound like a broken record here, but if you go too fast and people haven't understood the why, you're going to be dragging them along. You're going to be pulling them uphill with a rope, and it's going to be very, very challenging. And I don't care if you want to do that in a week, a month, or a quarter, it's likely not going to be successful and get it done. So my comment is, it's change is almost like painting a room. If you've ever done this in an old house, there is so much upfront work that needs to be done in terms of all the scraping and the patching and the priming, and it feels like it's going to take forever and nothing's happening. There's no gratification in doing those steps. And all of a sudden you get that done and you get out your roller, and in 20 minutes, in a half an hour, you have this beautiful product. And so I encourage people to have patience going through the front end of the change process, because if you get that right, the rest will happen like this and it'll be magic. But if you try to do it too fast, using that patch job, you do a crummy job with the patching and you don't sand it, you'll get a little bit of instant gratification when you put the roller on. But then when the light turns, it's like, oh boy, that looks pretty crummy. And so be patient up front would be my advice.
That's great. I love that analogy. That's brilliant. I would add two quick things. I've seen them. One will be initiative overload, where, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of organizations have strategic plans. And so it was one instance where I went in and actually moved to the city of Seattle to do this project. And because there was another big technology initiative going on at the same time, all the people I needed on my team were going to other workshops. And so we shut the project down. Because we were just sitting there by ourselves. The client wasn't getting any value. So making sure that you integrate your project with other things that are going along and looking at the resource draw from the people. And then the other thing I might add in there is benefits capture. So as you're going through the process, making sure you're updating people on what's been happening, good, bad, and indifferent. But the benefits capture, if there's some ROI you're capturing, good things that Allan did or John or Charles did, benefit capture and sharing of those stories are some things that are very important from what I've seen as well.
All right. Well, gentlemen, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you both for your information and insight. We really appreciate you doing this for the Connected Systems Institute. I want to thank our attendees for their great questions and active participation. We'll be posting the recording from today's session on the CSI Events website. You can access it there shortly. I will invite all of you to tune in on Thursday, May 21st, when we'll hear from Gary Martz and Darren Blue from Intel. Much has been said about the lack of standards, especially when new projects are extended due to lack of standards. The need for agility, the ability to plug and play with new applications as your business evolves is driving this consortium of end users to band together to demand change for the industry. Join us as Gary and Darren lead us through this discussion. They've had some success, which will be explained here in this session, the Open Standards Application Form Explained, an hour-long webinar brought to you by the UW-Milwaukee Connected Systems Institute. Please register for this event at uwm.edu/CSI/events. My name is Charles Mosley, signing off for today. Thank you for attending.
Thanks, Charles, Mary, and John. It was a pleasure.
Thank you again.
Absolutely.